What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back today to offer my first impressions of Blasphemous 2, which dropped on the PC, the Nintendo Switch, the PlayStation 5, as well as the Xbox Series X and Series S. I'm nowhere close to finishing it and still have many bosses to go, but having played the first one and now having played a decent chunk of the second, I'm confident about giving some advice about whether or not people should throw down some cash to play this game, and the short answer would be yes. And in that I have way more experience talking about film and television than I do about video games, my question for myself always is, how much of the game should I play before offering my thoughts? And basically my rule that I made up for myself was that I would play until my left thumb got completely raw and sore, and then I would start to talk. And on the whole, I'm going to keep this video totally spoiler-free. There are a lot of secrets and puzzles to this game, and I might share a few details at the end of the video just to back up a few points, but let's get into the thick of things. In case you've never heard of Blasphemous 2, it is a side-scrolling game in the Metroidvania subgenre, developed by the Game Kitchen and published by Team 17. It is a sequel to the 2019 game Blasphemous, a game which, by the way, I first heard about due to comments on this channel and I ended up loving it. And while the game officially dropped today, physical versions of the game are set to be released on September 15th. And in terms of the character, the story, and the setting in this game, players assume control of the Penitent One, a silent knight who must embark on a new adventure in a new kingdom to prevent the rebirth of a curse named the Miracle. The story of the game is set after the Wounds of Eventide update of the original game. And if the story and the premise sound overly mysterious or overly vague, that's kind of like the whole shtick or the appeal of the Blasphemous franchise. In this series, while the gameplay is awesome, a big part of the appeal is this really unusual aesthetic or style or atmosphere that's hard to pin down, apart from saying that there's a lot of religious guilt and shame and like blood sacrifice or ominous premonitions of doom. And some might say that it's going for a similar vibe to Dark Souls, but I feel like the Blasphemous franchise is much more rooted in kind of a Western European, very Catholic sensibility. And what I would recommend for people is that they watch the Spanish language release date trailer for this game, because if you like what you see there, because it offers some animation, it offers some cutscenes, it offers some gameplay, like that is more or less the gaming experience that you are going to have. Which leads me to one of my only critiques of the game, where I wish there were an option to play the game in Spanish, but with English subtitles, because that Spanish flavor is a huge part of the game. It's made by a Spanish developer, the Game Kitchen, and as far as whether or not it's worth it to throw down cash to play it is concerned, I would say at about $30, 100%. I always compare dollar per minute to like going to the movies or buying a Blu-ray. Like if you spend $20 to see an IMAX movie for 2 or 3 hours of entertainment, or if you spend $25 or $30 on a Blu-ray, which you might watch a couple times, you're basically spending $10 an hour for that entertainment. Well, with a game like Blasphemous, you'll get your money's worth many times over before all is said and done. It's one of those games that very quickly gets its hooks into you, and I knew this game kind of had its fingers around my throat the first time I screamed in rage while playing it. And usually when you scream in rage, two things are going to happen. You're going to throw your controller against the wall and quit, or you're like, fuck you, and you jump back into the game and try to overcome whatever obstacle just laid you low. And I had the second reaction. Much like in the first game, there's a wide array of very small, minuscule upgrades which give you little incremental increases in power, which kind of create the illusion that you're getting stronger, but in the end you're going to hit many skill walls, and no matter how many upgrades you get, skill is going to allow you to prevail, not the upgrades. However, these little upgrades along the way, they're so compulsively addictive, where I found myself playing with what I can only describe as kind of a happy but aggressive snarl, where I was pissed and I was enjoying myself, but like I was neglecting my water, I was neglecting the bathroom, I was neglecting everything, and that's when you know a game really has its hooks into you. When you turn your phone off and you start neglecting the outside world, you start neglecting your own physical needs, all at the expense of just playing the game. And to be perfectly honest, I needed this palate cleanser badly. For the last couple of weeks, I've been obsessively playing Baldur's Gate 3, which, to be fair, I think is one of the best games that I've ever played in any era, on any platform. I would rank it next to any great fantasy novel, any great fantasy movie, any great fantasy experience you can imagine. I think Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be a Hall of Fame media experience that people are going to be talking about for fucking years. But I've been playing it so much that I'm starting to have like post-traumatic stress. Like at night, I'm dreaming about Baldur's Gate 3, and so I wake up and my eyes still feel like sandpaper, and I feel like I've been up all night playing the game. I'm like, oh my God. And it's almost like having like a drug in your home where you have two options. You can throw the drug away, or you can do all of the drugs just so you kind of like finish them and get them out of your life. And I've been kind of going with that approach with Baldur's Gate 3, and I've already cleared it on its like normal mode. Now I'm playing through on the harder difficulty setting, but I needed a palate cleanser. And Blasphemous 2 was the perfect palate cleanser because it is action, it is reflex-based, it is skill-based, as opposed to Baldur's Gate 3, which is strategy-based. And the only thing that's going to stop me from going right back to Baldur's Gate 3 when I'm done with this video is the fact that I have to get prepared for Armored Core 6, which is coming out tomorrow, which apparently is fucking phenomenal, which is the latest game from Software, some of the best gaming developers in the world. But you might be asking, is Blasphemous 2 better or worse than the first? If you've never played either, would it be worth it just buying the first or the second? It's hard to say because I feel like I was able to jump into Blasphemous 2 much more quickly because I'd played Blasphemous 1. Just little things like the parry and counter mechanic, you will perfect it in the first game, and depending upon which weapons you choose in the second game, you may or may not be doing a lot of parrying and countering. However, if you haven't already developed those skills in like Elden Ring or Dark Souls or one of those other kinds of games, you might not be used to the parry and counter approach to a game. But I think Blasphemous 2 offers a few quality of life improvements. It's much more intuitive. I felt like with the first one, I was having to look up a lot of guides, like, oh my God, like, what are these weird little items that I'm finding and who do I need to bring them to? And like, there was so little hand-holding that I was kind of helpless at first. But because I played Blasphemous 1, now I know this world and I know their system, and it's much more intuitive. I figured, oh, this little chisel needs to go to this wood carver so he can carve this statue, which I can put in my inventory, blah, blah, blah. So I think Blasphemous 2 is a better game, but I don't know if it's the game that people should start with if they're looking to kind of learn how to play the Blasphemous style. But if you're really familiar with the Metroidvania kind of format, then you're going to be good to go. And I love the fact that in 2023, 2D side-scrolling Metroidvania games are as popular as they are, because I know they're being played by people who were not even remotely alive when Castlevania and Metroid were first gaining popularity in the mid and late 80s. Like, I was part of that generation that bought their NES back in like 1987. I was 11 years old, and I played Metroid and Castlevania till my eyeballs bled. I was much more of a Metroid guy, much better at Metroid than Castlevania. Like, when I watch speed runs of Castlevania and I see people clearing it in 12 minutes, I'm like, well, I spent like 12 years playing it. I never completed the first game. Like, I completed Super Castlevania, and my favorite like Metroidvania kind of Castlevania game has to be Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I feel like that's where the Metroidvania kind of subgenre really crystallized, and that's a game that I find myself revisiting every few years. But it's incredible how this format of gaming has become its own subgenre, where like certain weapons and certain items will open up parts of the map, and obviously you're going to constantly, it's almost like ironing a shirt, where you're going over the same parts of the game over and over and over again, and depending upon which weapons you found, which items you found, you'll have access to different things, and you kind of see the map in a whole new light. And so throughout this first session, I just found myself marking all these little areas like to go back and like be explored at a later date when I have more gear. And it's just a blast when you go back through those. You're like, oh my God, that's a completely different zone that I overlooked the first time through. So I hope that developers will continue to make games in this format, because I feel like these games lend themselves really, really easily and readily to speed runs. I can't tell you how many speed runs I've watched of Super Metroid with 4 players going side by side where they're racing, and it's quite literally little split-second moments where if you miss a major move, then you're going to fall a few seconds behind, and it's like watching fucking NASCAR. It's incredible. But in the same way that Castlevania has a very specific flavor and mood, that kind of gothic horror like mix of like undead and castles and that sort of thing, in the same way Metroid has its own unique flavor. I mean, no one, if you've played the NES Metroid, you will never forget that soundtrack and just the look and feel of that world. And I feel like Blasphemous has its own look, its own feel, and the art style is just right up my alley. And I love how like the lore, the setting, the aesthetic, it all comes together like chocolate and peanut butter, creating a certain mood or a certain flavor where you almost feel like some weird monk in the Middle Ages, like walking through this horrible place, like lashing yourself with like a spiked or barbed wit, like suffering from whatever sins you might have committed, but at the same time, you're willing to pull out a sword and fuck people up. Because while I really enjoy the gameplay, and I think it's exciting and it's challenging, I mean, it's definitely challenging. There's so many skill walls and so many bosses you're like, oh my God, I think I need to do just a few attempts on this boss where I don't even attack, where I just learn how to dodge all the mechanics before I fight him for real. But the animated sequences are so cool. This game almost feels like a first pass at a possible animated series for someone like Netflix. And what's interesting is how gaming now is upstream from film and television. And I feel like for the longest time we'd see all these kind of crummy video game adaptations of hit movies. But now I feel like moving forward, a lot of the best ideas for shows and movies are going to come directly from games, whether you're talking about The Last of Us or Super Mario Brothers or Arcane. Like for decades, video game movies were absolutely unwatchable, but now it's like, goddamn, like you can see it all in this game. there's an animated series or a minimum an animated feature that is screaming to be made from the Blasphemous world, or we can just put all the cutscenes and cinematics together and have a pretty cool short film just right then and there. And my favorite moments in these games are when I walk into a room and find some really strange NPC, whether it's like a giant naked woman with 3 heads with like a cross impaled through them. I'm just making things up, but that's the kind of crap that you will see. But you'll see something with all this kind of crazy, provocative, strange, disturbing religious and or sexual imagery involving repentance, guilt, shame, sin, sacrifice, all that stuff. And then you have to figure out, like, what is this strange kind of babbling nonsense that they're sharing with me? Like, what do I need to bring them, or what are they going to unlock for me? Like, how is this all going to kind of come together? It's a really interesting jigsaw puzzle, and I love how, like, you're constantly like purging yourself of guilt to get your full power back, but also you have like this just jaw-dropping like Spanish guitar or classical guitar kind of playing in the background. This is a style of storytelling that has a lot more to give. But as far as gameplay is concerned, I really enjoy games that give you a big challenge right at the opening as like, this is a skill check, and if you can't get through this boss, well, then you're probably not going to like this game. Like Dark Souls 3, I felt like was a great example of that, where you couldn't even save your game until you'd killed the first boss. And I remember when that game first came out in 2016, I kept watching all these videos where like where do I save? Like, this guy keeps kicking ass. Like, how do I get stronger? How do I level up my skills so that I can beat him? And they're like, no. You cannot level up your skills until you beat this first boss. And that's a little bit of a skill wall. And this game has a few skill walls because you can't just go off and kill a bunch of enemies, pump some points in the strength or endurance, and come back a little stronger and beat them next time. Like, there are a limited number of upgrades that you can get. And my advice with the bosses is just be very patient. Pick your moments to strike. Don't get greedy. It's a dance. Once you learn the dance, the boss will go down. But what's interesting about this approach versus the last one, right at the outset, you have to pick between 3 main weapons. And not to worry, whatever weapon you pick, you'll get a chance to kind of pick up the other ones as you go and explore. But you have to choose between like this giant ball and chain, or kind of the classic 2-handed sword, or more of like kind of like dagger and rapier, kind of like quick approach. And each style not only is a different form of gameplay with different like strengths and weaknesses, but also every weapon has the ability to unlock certain areas on the map. And there's some puzzles where you'll need to have more than one of the weapons in order to use them like in conjunction with one another to kind of get a gate to go up or to get a door to open. But I think it's cool how your first few hours in this game are going to differ dramatically depending upon which weapon you choose. And I chose the big-ass ball and chain because even though it's slow and cumbersome, I just like being able to hit things hard. Like when you're getting angry and you're getting frustrated, sometimes it's nice just to beat the fucking shit out of something with a big, heavy weapon. But what it really reminded me of was the good old days of playing the original Metroid on the NES, where depending upon whether or not you had the freeze ray or the wave ray, that would allow you to fight different bosses or enemies in a different fashion and have different pros and cons to the 2 different approaches. So it's a super old school mechanic, but it just gives you different styles of gameplay that are a lot of fun. Now, I don't know if everybody feels this way, but I love games where you're constantly doubling back, creating shortcuts or creating new paths to get to different zones, where suddenly like you feel like you know the whole world like the back of your hand. I feel like the first half of the first Dark Souls was like that, where you kind of knew how everything was connected and allows you to play with much more efficiency and a lot more economy. But in addition to the 3 main weapons, there are obviously a ton of spells, and there are also, of course, like little rosary beads and little upgrades. Like you can figure out like, do I want to be like a melee heavy person who's really resistant to like physical attacks, or do I want to be able to stand back and zap people with spells and be resistant to magic? Like there's some customization involved, but in the end, you're jumping, you're hitting, you're jumping off walls. Like in the end, this is a skill-based game, so I feel like all these little weapons and spells, they're just icing on the cake. But I've gone pretty far without saying anything negative about this game, and I do have one major complaint that's tied into one thing that I really love. That while I was opening up the game and unlocking certain parts of the map and, like now that I have this weapon, I can go here. Now that I have this, I can go there. The problem is like I got a little bit of a paralysis through overanalysis where I was like, oh my God, like there's like 100 different ways to go. Like sometimes a little bit of like a linear experience can be like, all right, I need to go that direction and I can kind of zig and zag, but in the end I'm going that way. With this game, I was like, where are just the bosses? I want to make some progress, and I couldn't ever quite tell. Like, am I investing too many hours in this one zone that might be too hard up front, or is this exactly where I'm supposed to be, but it's just challenging because it's a Blasphemous game? And the map does show you where like the first 3 main bosses are, but it's like you look on the map, oh, like boss there, boss there, boss there. But to get there, it's like you got to go in such a roundabout way. You're like, all right, I'm going to go fucking crazy if I don't find another goddamn boss. So I think it's a little frustrating at first that the map is just so vast and so complex. And I wouldn't have minded a few mini bosses kind of scattered around just to give us the illusion of progress. But in closing, I'll just say it's nice to have a game where you can pop in for a half hour or an hour, get a little jolt of adrenaline, turn it off, and go back to your life, because most of the games that I get kind of sucked into are the games that take over your life for months, if not years. I'm like, oh my God, like on my deathbed, am I going to want all this time back? Like I love my gaming experiences, but also hate them because they are so all-consuming at the expense of everything else. And sometimes it's nice just to have a game like, you know what, I've got an hour before I got to go meet these people for dinner. Let's go into Blasphemous 2 and fuck some people up for a while, get my adrenaline going. And like, there's certain games where like they wake you up, and the other games you're like, they're so mentally taxing, they kind of make you exhausted. Baldur's Gate 3, my first playthrough, there were times where I was like, oh my God, like this zone is so complicated. I'm putting myself to sleep just from like the mental challenge of trying to figure it out. Blasphemous 2, I can tell is one of those games where if I've got a short amount of time, I'm going to pop in there, smash a few people, and have a very good time. But it's going to have to wait a little bit because Armored Core 6 comes out tomorrow. And judging from the history of From Software's games, whether you're talking about Sekiro or the Dark Souls series or Elden Ring, like they've made some of the best games of the last 10 years. I have a feeling I'll play that for a day or two, and then I'm going to get the itch to go back to Baldur's Gate 3. Like I said, Baldur's Gate 3 is one of my favorite gaming experiences. It's one of my favorite media experiences in any format ever. But I'm thrilled that I took a little break to play Blasphemous 2. But you know what? I've gotten this far without offering any spoilers of any kind. And I could offer a few little kind of tips for beginners about like how frequently to save or where to find the early vendors to like upgrade your skills and things like that. But they honestly, they're not going to have like a massive kind of impact on my overall impressions on the game or what I'm trying to sell people on. So long story short, $30 for this game. 100% worth it. And if money's a little tight right now, check out the price on the first one. There might be some sales out there right now. It only came out a couple years ago. It's still well worth playing, and it's more or less the same goddamn game. Blasphemous 2 is just more blasphemous for people who've already played the first one to death and are craving some new experiences and some new challenges. But I think that's all I've got to say, because like I said, I've got to get my clips and all my images ready for friggin' Armored Core 6, which I'm beyond fired up to play tomorrow. But I'm starting to ramble at this point. Long story short, Blasphemous 2, it's fucking cool. Check it out, and I look forward to the day when an animated film or an animated show comes out that is based on this unique intellectual property. So to whoever recommended the first one on this channel in the comments years ago, my thanks goes to you, because you've given me many hours of some absolutely riveting entertainment. But I think that's all I got to say. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell to be notified about future videos, and hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrax if you want to talk more. But I can't thank you enough for listening to my rant. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.